In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one man who watched a Mekboy build a gun that only fires if you believe it will, and then watched it stop working mid-battle at the worst possible moment. Not because a wire pulled or a part broke, because he said something. 5 words, maybe 6, in the middle of a fight loud enough to feel in your kidneys. They got into the mech's skull and made him think. That was enough to kill him. It nearly killed everything within a kilometer. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Sullick Vorne, a heavy weapons loader from a Forge auxiliary world that the orcs went through in 9 days. Through the trenches, the minefields, the orbital batteries, all of it textbook, all of it gone. The wall fell. The defenders ran out of shells, then stones, then hands. And what was left of him got swept up into the green tide, where he slowly, without noticing, began to see the galaxy the way they do. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. I watched a Mekboy build a weapon that could only fire if you believed it would, and then I watched it stop working mid-battle at the worst possible moment, and the reason it stopped working was me. Not because I pulled a wire or broke a piece, because I said something. 5 words, maybe 6, in the middle of a fight so loud you could feel it in your kidneys. And those words got inside the Mekboy's skull and did something that no Lascanin, no Bolter, no Astartes blade had ever managed to do. They made him think. That was enough. That killed him, and it nearly killed every living thing within a kilometer, myself included. But I should start earlier, much earlier, because none of it makes sense unless you understand what it is to live among orcs, to breathe their air, eat their scraps, and slowly, without noticing it, start to see the galaxy the way they do. My name is Sullick Vorne. I was a loader with the WAAAGH 112th Muster, assigned to the heavy weapons platoon. My job was carrying ammunition, shell after shell, magazine after magazine, battery pack after battery pack. If you have never been a loader, you cannot understand how the role shapes you. You become a counter. You know the weight of a Lascanin power cell to the gram. You know how many autocannon rounds fit in a standard crate, how many crates fit on a Chimera's rear rack, how long a heavy bolter can sustain fire before the barrel warps. These are not interesting facts, but they kept me alive before and after the fall of WH40K. WH40K was a Forge auxiliary world, not a proper Forge world with its own Mechanicus sovereignty, but a supplier. We made parts, casing components, barrel blanks, stabilizer rings. The population was about 400,000, give or take the seasonal labor drafts. I was born there, raised in Habstack 11, and mustered into the local regiment at 17 because the tithe came due and my name was on the list. I did not volunteer. Nobody volunteers on WH40K. You serve because the paper says you serve, and that is the end of the conversation. I was 23 when the orcs came. We had 18 months of warning, which is generous by Imperial standards. The sector command sent 3 regiments to reinforce the local garrison. They built new trench works, laid minefields, positioned orbital batteries. It was textbook. And the orcs went through all of it in 9 days. 9 days. I had counted ammunition for the heavy weapons emplacements on the southern wall. We had enough shells for 2 weeks of sustained bombardment. We used them in 4 days. Then we used stones. Then we used our hands. Then we stopped using anything because the wall was gone and the orcs were inside the city, and there was nothing left to defend. I was captured on the 9th day. Not heroically. I was unconscious in a drainage channel with a broken collarbone and a concussion. An orc found me, picked me up by the ankle, shook me the way you might shake a boot to check for stones, and carried me to a cage. That cage held maybe 30 other humans, mostly soldiers, a few factory workers who had been caught in the open. The cage was made of scrap metal welded badly together, and it smelled like rust and blood and the thick, fungal stink that follows orcs everywhere. That smell, I should say, is something you never get used to. You just stop noticing it after a while, which is different. It is still there. It is always there. Within 2 days, the cage was sorted. The orcs are not organized in the way the Imperium understands organization, but they have a brutal efficiency about resource allocation. The weak and the wounded who could not walk were killed, not out of cruelty specifically, out of a kind of impatient practicality that I would come to recognize as the fundamental orc approach to everything. If it does not work, break it. If it cannot be broken, hit it harder. If it still does not work after that, throw it away and get a new one. That is how they treat their weapons, their vehicles, their Gretchen, and their human captives. We were sorted by apparent usefulness. Those who looked strong were pulled aside for manual labor. Those who showed any technical aptitude were examined more closely, usually by being thrown a piece of broken equipment and watched to see what they did with it. I was in the second group, not because I am particularly clever, but because when they threw a jammed autogun at me, I cleared the jam without thinking. 18 months of stripping and cleaning heavy weapons will teach your hands to work, even when your brain is screaming at you to play dead. That decision, that automatic muscle memory response, is what delivered me to WAAAGH Rivet Gob. And that delivery is what eventually led to every single thing I am about to describe. WAAAGH Rivet Gob was a big mech. I did not know this at first. To my untrained eye, every orc looked roughly the same, which is to say, enormous, green, loud, and built like a siege engine someone had wrapped in skin. But WAAAGH was different in ways that became clear quickly. He was quieter than most orcs, which does not mean quiet. It means he sometimes went several minutes without bellowing. He wore more metal than flesh, with one arm replaced entirely by a hydraulic claw that could crush a man's skull or thread a bolt with equal precision. His left eye was a nest of lenses, red and amber, and one sickly green that clicked and whirred when he focused on something. He was massive, even by orc standards, easily 3 meters tall, and he had the broad, sloped posture of a creature that spent most of its time bent over a workbench. His workshop was built into the belly of the warband's flagship, a kill cruiser called Dagut Krumpa, that had been welded into the heart of a far larger structure. A drifting agglomeration of captured hulls, salvaged wrecks, and orc-built additions that the greenskins treated as a single vessel. Any Imperial naval officer would have called the whole thing an atrocity. The workshop itself occupied what had once been the cruiser's main cargo hold. It was a cathedral of junk, heaps of salvaged metal, stripped vehicle components, Xenos technology mixed in with Imperial gear, all of it piled without order but somehow navigable to the Mekboy's mind. The floor was slick with oil and coolant, and things I chose not to identify. The ceiling was so thick with hanging chains and suspended projects that it looked like an inverted forest of iron. And the noise. There was always noise. Hammering, welding, the scream of cutting tools, the dull rhythmic groan of the ship's own engines, shaking everything through the deck plating. I was thrown into this space along with 11 other human captives and 6 Gretchen. The Gretchen had been WAAAGH's assistants before us, and they regarded us with the hostile suspicion of workers who see their replacements arriving. They were right to be suspicious. Within a week, 2 of the Gretchen were dead, killed by WAAAGH for mistakes that I could not even identify. One of them had apparently installed a rivet upside down. WAAAGH held the offending rivet in front of the Gretchen's face, said, "That's uppy down, you git," and then removed the Gretchen's head with a casual backhand of the hydraulic claw. The other had sneezed near a delicate mechanism. WAAAGH did not even speak to that one, just the claw and then silence, and then he went back to work as if nothing had happened. He did mutter something afterward that Torben translated as roughly equivalent to, "Snotty gits got no business being near the worky bits." Of the 11 humans, 3 died in the first month. 1 tried to escape and was caught by a knob named Skullkrunk, who used him as a demonstration piece for a new chopper. 1 died of infection from an untreated wound. The 3rd simply stopped eating and faded away, which is a thing that happens to people in captivity more often than you might expect. I watched it happen. One morning, she was sitting against the wall, staring at nothing. By evening, she was still sitting there, but the quality of the stillness had changed. I checked for a pulse and found nothing. There was no drama to it. She just decided to stop, and her body obeyed. The remaining 8 of us learned the rules quickly. WAAAGH's workshop ran on a system that was almost comprehensible if you squinted at it from the right angle. The Mekboy wanted things built. He would bellow instructions in orc language, which is not truly a language so much as a collection of violent sounds arranged in roughly meaningful patterns. At first, I understood nothing. By the 2nd month, I understood perhaps 1 word in 5. By the 4th month, I could follow basic commands. Give us da zappy thing meant hand him a power cell. Give us da over zappy thing meant hand him a different power cell. Not dat zappy thing, ya useless squig-brained nuffin, meant you had chosen poorly and should duck. The grammar, if you can call it that, is contextual. The same sound can mean 3 different things depending on whether the Mekboy is angry, excited, or thinking. Since WAAAGH was usually all 3 simultaneously, interpretation was a gamble. You guessed, you acted, and you prayed to the Emperor that your guess was right. If it was wrong, you got hit. If it was wrong in a way that damaged something WAAAGH cared about, you got hit harder. If it was wrong in a way that ruined something WAAAGH cared about deeply, you got the claw. Nobody survived the claw. My survival strategy was simple. I counted. I counted rivets, bolts, charge packs, wire lengths, fuel quantities, ammunition stocks. I became WAAAGH's inventory. When he needed 412 bracket pins for a gun assembly, I knew where they were and how many remained. When he was welding a chassis and needed to know how much fuel was left in the torch, I could tell him by the weight of the canister. This made me useful in a way that was specific and difficult to replace. The other human slaves were strong backs and steady hands, interchangeable, expendable. I was the one who knew where things were. And in WAAAGH's workshop, where chaos was the natural state, and finding a specific component could take hours of digging through scrap piles, that knowledge was worth more than muscle. I will not pretend that I was treated well. I slept on a metal shelf bolted to the wall of the workshop, wrapped in a piece of canvas that smelled like engine grease. I ate what the Gretchen ate, which was mostly fungus in various states of decay, occasionally supplemented by whatever meat was available, and I learned early not to ask what the meat had been before it was meat. I was struck regularly because orcs communicate through violence the way humans communicate through language. A cuff on the head was a greeting, a kick was a reprimand, a thrown wrench was a question. I learned to read the force behind the blow, to gauge the intention. Light hit, no real anger. Medium hit, you made a mistake, correct it. Hard hit, you are in danger. Very hard hit. Someone else is about to die to make a point, and you should be elsewhere. The days blurred. Time moves differently when your world shrinks to the dimensions of a single room and your purpose shrinks to the dimensions of a single task. I sorted parts. I carried loads. I learned, against every instinct, to anticipate what Mugzorg wanted before he asked for it. This was not loyalty. This was survival mechanics, pure and clean. The better I predicted the Mekboy's needs, the less I got hit. The less I got hit, the longer I lived. The longer I lived, the more I learned. And the more I learned, the more I understood something that no Imperial scholar, no Mechanicus adept, no Ordo Xenos interrogator had ever understood from the inside. Orc technology should not work. That statement is not poetry. It is not metaphor. It is engineering fact. I have held Orc weapons in my hands, pulled them apart, examined every component, and I can tell you with the certainty of a man who spent years handling Imperial munitions that these things should not function. The barrel alignments are wrong. The firing mechanisms are backwards, or missing, or made of materials that should shatter on the first discharge. The ammunition does not fit the chambers. The power cells are wired in configurations that should cause immediate overload. And yet they fire. They fire accurately, powerfully, and lethally, and they do this because the orc holding the weapon believes they will. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like superstition, like the ramblings of a man who has been hit in the head too many times by a green-skinned brute. But I have seen it. I have watched Mugzorg assemble a weapon from parts that had no business being in the same room together, pick it up, point it at a target, pull the trigger, and send a bolt of energy screaming downrange that blew a hole in a ferrocrete wall. And then I have picked up that same weapon minutes later, pulled the same trigger, and nothing happened. Not a misfire, not a jam. Nothing. The weapon was dead in my hands. Dead the way a stone is dead, and I could not understand why until I started to understand the orcs themselves. The WAAAGH field, that is what the Ordo Xenos calls it, or so I was told once by a man who claimed to have read a classified document about it. I do not know if that term is accurate. What I know is what I observed. The orcs generate something, a force, a pressure. You cannot see it, but you can feel it if you are around enough of them for long enough. It is like standing near a furnace with your eyes closed. You know the heat is there even if you cannot point to the flame. When a large group of orcs gets excited, when they are gearing up for a fight, or celebrating a kill, or working themselves into a frenzy over something, the air itself changes. Your teeth ache, your skin prickles, the hair on your arms stands up. And things happen. Impossible things. Machines that were dead start running. Weapons that were jammed suddenly fire. Engines that had no fuel somehow turn over and roar to life. The more orcs there are, the stronger it gets. The more they believe something will work, the more it does. Mugzorg understood this better than any orc I ever encountered. Most orcs do not think about the WAAAGH field the way a fish does not think about water. It is simply the medium they exist in, invisible and omnipresent and unquestioned. But Mugzorg was different. Mugzorg thought about things, which is an unusual and slightly dangerous trait in an orc. He would sometimes sit at his bench for hours, his lenses clicking, his claw opening and closing absently, staring at a piece of equipment as if trying to see through it to some deeper truth. The other orcs found this unsettling. A thinking orc is an unpredictable orc, and unpredictable orcs are either future war bosses or future corpses. Mugzorg navigated this tension by being extremely good at what he did. His weapons worked better than anyone else's. His vehicles ran longer, hit harder. moved faster. The war boss, a bloated mountain of scarred green muscle named Kragmau Gutbasha, tolerated Mugzog's eccentricities because Mugzog's creations won battles. I learned to read Mugzog's moods by the speed of his lenses. When they clicked slowly, he was calm, thinking, planning. When they sped up, he was excited, usually about to try something new and probably explosive. When they locked, when all the lenses aligned on a single focal point and went still, he was angry, and you did not want to be the object of that focus. I saw him kill a knob once for interrupting his work at a bad moment. The knob was twice Mugzog's weight and covered in battle scars, a veteran fighter who had survived decades of warfare. Mugzog grabbed him by the throat with the hydraulic claw, lifted him off the ground, and squeezed until something inside the knob's neck made a sound like a branch snapping. Then he dropped the body, looked at it for a moment, removed 3 good teeth from the jaw because waste is offensive to a Mekboy, pocketed them, and went back to work. The other orcs watched this happen and said nothing. In Orc society, a Mekboy's workshop is his domain. What happens inside it is his business. And Mugzog's business was building things that killed. The workshop's other human slaves and I developed a hierarchy of our own, although calling it a hierarchy gives it more structure than it deserved. There was Brannick, a former tank driver from the WAAAGH Armored Company, who was the largest of us, and therefore assigned the heaviest lifting. He was a quiet man with enormous hands and a habit of humming the same 4 bars of a hymn over and over, the same fragment on a loop, day after day. I never learned what hymn it was. I never asked. There was Kellum, who had been a clerk in the Forge Auxiliaries Administrative Division, and who handled the more delicate assembly work because her fingers were small and steady. She was methodical and precise, and never spoke unless spoken to, and she survived longer than most of us because she never made mistakes. There was Torben, a conscript like me, young, not yet 20 when captured, who had a knack for understanding orc language that bordered on unsettling. He could parse Mugzog's bellowed instructions faster than any of us, sometimes before Mugzog had finished bellowing them, and this skill made him valuable but also marked him. The Gretchen hated him for it. They saw him as competition, an alien creature encroaching on their role as interpreters and intermediaries, and they made his life difficult in the small, vicious ways that Gretchen excel at. Stolen food, sabotaged tools, dung in his sleeping spot. There were others, but their names have blurred. People came and went from Mugzog's workshop. Some were traded to other Mekboys. Some were killed in accidents, which were frequent and spectacular. Some were taken by orc knobs who needed slaves for other purposes. The population of human captives in the workshop fluctuated between 6 and 15 at any given time, and I learned not to invest too much in learning names until someone had survived at least a month. Before that threshold, they were just faces. The work itself was repetitive and dangerous. Mugzog built weapons. That was his primary function, his obsession, his reason for existing. He built shutas, which are the orc equivalent of a firearm, though calling them firearms is like calling a rabbit grox, a house pet. He built big shooters, which are larger and louder and more prone to exploding. He built rocket launchers, which are tubes that fire rockets in approximately the direction you point them, with an emphasis on approximately. He once built a weapon he called Das Scream Gun that produced no visible projectile but made a sound so violent that 3 Gretchen bled from their ears during testing, and Mugzog declared it perfect. It was not. It blew up a week later. He did not seem bothered. He built custom pieces for knobs and the war boss,
flashy, oversized things covered in spikes and trophies and excessive amounts of WAAAGH, which is the orc term for firepower, and also, depending on context, for the sound that firepower makes, and also for the concept of firepower as a universal good. WAAAGH is not just a word, it is a philosophy. More WAAAGH is always better. There is no such thing as enough WAAAGH. If you think you have enough WAAAGH, you are wrong, and the solution to being wrong is more WAAAGH. I once watched Mekboy bolt 6 gun barrels onto a weapon designed for one, simply because a knob had paid for the most WAAAGH. The weapon fired once, sent the knob spinning backward into a wall, and Mekboy considered this a satisfied customer. My role in this process was support. I organized materials. I held components in place while Mekboy welded them. I cleaned barrels, sorted ammunition, lubricated mechanisms. I tested firing pins by hand, which is a task that sounds simple until you realize that an orc firing pin is often a sharpened piece of metal the length of your forearm that is under tension, equivalent to a small spring-loaded trap. And if it slips while you are testing it, you lose fingers. I lost 2. The little finger on my left hand, which was crushed by a bracket that fell from a shelf, and the ring finger on the same hand, which was taken by a firing pin that I tested incorrectly. Mekboy found this amusing. He offered to have one of the pain boys replace them with metal ones, which was generous by orc standards, but which I declined because I had seen what the pain boys did. The ship's pain boy was a creature called Gutsnip, who operated out of what he called the surgery, which was a blood-slicked table bolted to a corridor wall, and whose idea of anesthesia was hitting the patient on the head with a hammer until they stopped screaming. I watched Gutsnip reattach an orc's arm once. He put it on backwards. The orc did not notice for 2 days, and when he did notice, Gutsnip charged him extra to turn it around. I would rather have 8 fingers than 10 fingers that were not mine and were possibly not even facing the right direction. Over those months, I observed something that I did not have the framework to understand at the time. Mekboy's weapons, the ones he built with visible passion and pride, the ones he talked to as he assembled them, the ones he tested himself, fired from his own shoulder with a bellow of satisfaction. Those weapons worked flawlessly. Every time, without exception. But the weapons he built when he was bored, the routine commissions for regular boys, the mass-produced shooters that any Mekboy could bang out in an afternoon, those were unreliable. Not always. Sometimes they worked fine, but sometimes they jammed, or misfired, or exploded, or simply did nothing when the trigger was pulled. The difference was not craftsmanship. I examined both types. The construction was equally shoddy by any sane standard. The difference was something else, something I could feel but not name. Mekboy cared about certain weapons. He believed in them, and they worked. He did not care about others, and they did not always work. This observation sat in my mind like a stone in a boot. Uncomfortable, impossible to ignore, but equally impossible to act on. I filed it away and kept sorting rivets. The event that changed everything began on what I later calculated to be approximately my 5th month in captivity, during a period when the warband was between major engagements. The warband had conquered 3 worlds in rapid succession and was now in transit aboard a fleet of ramshackle ships, heading toward a new target that WAAAGH had selected based on criteria that I could not determine. Possibly intelligence reports from freebooters' scouts, possibly a dream, possibly he had thrown a skull at a star chart and attacked wherever it landed. With orcs, all 3 explanations are equally plausible. During transit, Mekboy grew restless. A restless Mekboy is a creative Mekboy, and a creative Mekboy is a dangerous thing to be near. He began working on something new, something different from his usual output. He cleared a section of the workshop which was unprecedented. He never cleared space. He simply built on top of whatever was already there, layer upon layer of machinery accruing like geological strata. But for this project, he swept an area clean, bolted a fresh workbench to the floor, and arranged his tools with a deliberation that was almost ritualistic. Torben translated his muttering for us, though Torben himself seemed uncertain about some of the concepts. WAAAGH was talking about belief. Not in the religious sense, not in the way an imperial citizen might discuss faith in the God Emperor. In a mechanical sense, he was talking about belief as a component, a material, something you could build into a weapon the way you build in a barrel or a trigger or a stock. He wanted to make a weapon that was powered by belief itself, not augmented by the why. Field the way all Orc technology was, but primarily, fundamentally, exclusively powered by it. A weapon that would fire if the user believed it would fire, and would not fire if the user did not believe. The other Orcs who heard about this project reacted with the range of responses you would expect. Some were enthusiastic, because Orcs are constitutionally incapable of hearing about a new weapon without getting excited. Some were confused, because the concept was too abstract for their straightforward minds. One boy asked Torben if the weapon could also make food, and when Torben said no, lost interest completely. A few of the older knobs were openly skeptical, which in Orc society manifests as insults and challenges, and occasionally headbutts. One of them, a scarred veteran named Grotzmaka, told WAAAGH that the idea was the dumbest thing since Bosleet tried to make a submarine out of a truck. The submarine, I later learned, had sunk immediately during a campaign on some ocean world, killing everyone aboard except Bosleet, who washed up on a beach 3 days later with no memory of how he got there. He had been promoted to battle wagon driver on the grounds that anyone who survived their own incompetence that spectacularly must be lucky, and luck was worth more than skill. WAAAGH ignored all of them. He worked. The weapon he built took 2 months. I know because I counted the days by meals, which were irregular but approximately twice per day cycle. 119 meals between the day he cleared the workbench and the day the weapon was finished. Call it 60 days, give or take. I helped build it. That fact is important to everything that comes after, so I want to be clear about it. I held panels in place. I sorted and delivered components. I ran diagnostics on power cells at WAAAGH's direction, testing voltage levels with crude instruments that I still do not fully understand. I watched every stage of the construction, and I can tell you that the weapon WAAAGH built should not have been able to do anything at all. It was shaped like a cannon, roughly. About 2 meters long, mounted on a wheeled carriage that could be pulled by Gretchen or bolted to a vehicle. The barrel was a patchwork of different metals, Imperial steel next to alien alloys, next to what I am fairly certain was a piece of a Chimera's exhaust manifold. Inside the barrel there was no rifling, no acceleration mechanism, no conventional means of propelling a projectile. There was a chamber, yes, but the chamber was not connected to the barrel in any meaningful way. There was a trigger, but the trigger was not connected to anything at all. It was a piece of curved metal attached to a grip. Pulling it activated no mechanism, released no spring, closed no circuit. It was purely ornamental. And there was something else, something I did not recognize. A lattice of wires and scrap metal wound around the chamber in a pattern that was almost, but not quite, geometric. It looked random at first glance, but the more I studied it, the more I sensed an underlying order. Not a human order, not an Imperial engineering standard. Something different, something organic and instinctive, the way a bird builds a nest from random twigs, but the result is always structurally sound. Mokzog called it da Fink Blaster. Torben translated this as something close to the Think Blaster, though he cautioned that the orc word Fink carried connotations that think did not. It was more like believe, feel, know, all compressed into a single syllable, a word for a concept that humans separate into multiple ideas, but orcs experience as one unified thing. The day Mokzog finished Da Fink Blaster, he took it to the testing range, which was a section of the ship's hull that had been designated for weapons testing by the simple expedient of blowing out the outer wall and replacing it with a heavy mesh screen. Targets were set up at various distances: scrap metal plates, old vehicle hulls, one unfortunate Gretchen who had been caught stealing from a nob's personal stash. The workshop slaves were herded along to watch, which was standard procedure. Mokzog liked an audience. He loaded the weapon. And by loaded, I mean he placed an object into the chamber. The object was a roughly spherical piece of metal, about the size of a fist. It did not appear to be a projectile in any conventional sense. It had no propellant, no guidance system, no explosive charge. It was just a lump of metal with a few wires trailing from it, like the tendrils of a sea creature. Mokzog gripped the handles. He aimed at the nearest target, a plate of armor steel about 30 meters away. He pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. He pulled again. Nothing. The weapon sat there, inert, dead, exactly as useless as any sane assessment of its construction would predict. The knobs watching began to laugh. One of them shouted something that Torben translated as roughly, "Your shooter is a pile of squig dung." Another bellowed, "De Grot could build better," which was particularly insulting because it implied a Mekboy's work was inferior to a Gretchen's, which in orc hierarchy is roughly equivalent to telling a general that a latrine cleaner could run his campaign. A third knob picked up a nearby wrench and threw it at the weapon, which is the orc equivalent of a formal critique. Mokzog did not respond. His lenses were clicking fast, but not with anger, with something else. He adjusted his grip. He planted his feet. He stared at the target. And then he did something that I have never seen another orc do before or since. He closed his eyes, all of them, the biological one and the mechanical ones. Every lens retracted and went dark. He stood there, blind, holding a weapon that did not work, surrounded by laughing warriors who would happily kill him if he showed weakness. And then he fired. The sound was unlike anything I had heard before, and I have heard a great many weapons discharge in my life. It was not a crack, not a boom, not a whine. It was a sound like reality tearing, like the air itself objected to what was happening and screamed in protest. A pulse of light, green, white, and blinding, erupted from the barrel. The metal sphere was gone. In its place, a bolt of raw force crossed the 30 meters to the target in less time than it takes to blink and hit the armor plate with an impact that I felt through the deck plating under my feet. The plate did not shatter. It did not melt. It ceased to exist. Where it had been, there was a hole, perfectly circular, about half a meter across, with edges that glowed dull orange. Beyond it, 3 more bulkheads had been pierced in diminishing circles, the bolt's energy dissipating as it punched through layer after layer of the ship's internal structure. The laughter stopped. The orcs stared. The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds, which is an eternity in orc terms, and then they erupted. Not in laughter this time, in cheering, in roaring. in that deep, guttural, thunderous bellow that is the Orc war cry, and their expression of joy and their prayer, all wrapped in one primal sound. WAAAGH! The deck shook with it. The walls vibrated. I felt it in my chest, in my bones, in my teeth. Mekboy opened his eyes. His lenses clicked once, slowly, like a man blinking away sleep. He looked at the hole in the bulkhead. He looked at the weapon. He looked at the cheering orcs. And he did something I had never seen him do before. He smiled, not the aggressive baring of tusks that passes for an orc smile. A real smile. A craftsman's smile. The smile of someone who has just proven a theory that everyone told him was impossible. In the days that followed, Mekboy tested Da Fink Blaster repeatedly. He fired it himself, and it worked every time. The results varied in intensity. Sometimes the bolt was devastating, punching through multiple bulkheads. Sometimes it was weaker, barely denting the target. Mekboy quickly identified the variable, his own level of conviction. When he believed absolutely, without reservation, that the weapon would fire and destroy the target, it did. When he merely expected it to work, it worked, but weakly. And on 2 occasions, when he was distracted or tired or annoyed by something else, the weapon failed entirely. Click. Nothing. Dead metal. Then he started letting other orcs fire it. This is where things became truly interesting. A knob named Grook was given the first opportunity. Grook was a massive specimen, aggressive, confident, the kind of orc who had never experienced doubt because he had never experienced a situation that his fists could not solve. He grabbed the weapon with enthusiasm, aimed at a target, screamed, "Wow, is the biggest!" which was not tactically meaningful but was apparently sufficient from a spiritual standpoint, and pulled the trigger. The bolt that erupted was enormous. It blew the target apart, along with the wall behind it and a section of corridor that had to be welded shut afterward to prevent decompression. Grook's belief was total, unqualified, a thing of perfect orc certainty, and the weapon responded accordingly. He patted the barrel afterward the way you might pat a good squighound. Mekboy slapped his hand away. The next orc to try was a boy named Snickgob, a younger, smaller fighter who was not yet proven in battle. Snickgob was nervous. Orcs can be nervous, though they experience it differently from humans. An orc's nervousness manifests as aggression directed at the wrong targets, fidgeting, excessive talking, and a general vibrating quality that I came to associate with performance anxiety, translated through a muscular system designed for combat. Snickgob grabbed the weapon, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The bolt was feeble, a sputtering flash that crossed half the distance to the target and dissipated in the air like a dying ember. The watching orcs laughed, and Snickgob was humiliated, which in orc society is a form of injury almost as damaging as a physical wound. He challenged another boy to a fight immediately afterward, won, and spent the rest of the day loudly insisting the weapon was mucked up, and he could have blown the whole ship up if it had been working proper. Nobody believed him. In orc society, the weapon had spoken, and the weapon's verdict was final. Mekboy was fascinated. He tested more subjects. The results correlated perfectly with the shooter's level of belief. The most confident, the most aggressive, the most certain orcs produced the most devastating shots. The hesitant, the uncertain, the doubtful produced nothing or almost nothing. It was a weaponized purity test, a tool that measured an orc's orcishness and turned it into destructive force. I watched all of this from my corner of the workshop, counting ammunition that was not ammunition, cataloging components that defied categorization, and I kept catching myself doing the one thing that could not be allowed near this weapon. I kept asking why, not out loud, but in my head, automatically, the way my hands automatically cleared jams. Why did the strong shots come from confident orcs? Why did the weak shots come from nervous ones? What was the variable? How did the mechanism function? I was a loader. I counted things. I needed to know the weight of every component, the function of every part. And the Fink Blaster had no function I could identify. Just that lattice, that trigger connected to nothing, and WAAAGH's absolute conviction. My need to understand the weapon was exactly the kind of thinking that could kill it. I did not know this yet, but the habit was there, running in the background, and I could not turn it off. 2 weeks after the first successful test, something else happened, something that shifted the ground under everything I thought I understood about my situation. I was sent to retrieve parts from a section of the ship I had never visited before. Dagut Krumpa was not a ship in any sense an Imperial shipwright would recognize. It was a collection of captured hulls, Space Hulk fragments, and purpose-built Orc additions, all lashed together with cables and boarding tubes, and in some cases physically welded hull to hull, forming a vast, sprawling, irregular structure at the heart of the warband's fleet. Sections of this agglomeration were familiar to me: the workshop, the nearby corridors, the testing range, the feeding area where humans were given their fungus rations. But vast stretches of it were unknown territory, and the deeper you went from the main habitation areas, the older and stranger the ship became. WAAAGH sent me with a Gretchen escort to find a specific component. He described it as a coil made from a metal that sang when you touched it. I had no idea what this meant, but the Gretchen seemed to know where to look, so I followed. We went down and down and down, through corridors that were no longer Orc-made, but belonged to the original human ships that had been incorporated into the Hulk, their Imperial architecture still visible beneath layers of Orc modification, through sections that were dark and cold and had not been visited in what might have been years, through a blast door that the Gretchen opened with a key made from what I recognized as a commissar's braid pin, which raised questions I did not ask. And there, in the belly of the ship, in a vast hold that had once been a cargo bay for an Imperial transport, I found them. Humans, not captured soldiers like me, not recent prisoners awaiting assignment. People, families, children. There were maybe 200 of them, living in the hold like a settlement crammed into a metal cave. They had built shelters from scrap, strung lights powered by stolen power cables, even cultivated patches of the Orc fungus that they ate alongside other food sources that I could not identify. They had clothes cobbled together from scraps but clearly maintained and repaired with care. They had tools, not Orc tools, and not Imperial tools, but their own tools. Crude things made from whatever materials they could scavenge, shaped by human hands for human purposes. They had children. That was the thing that stopped me in the corridor. Children. Small, pale, quiet children with wide eyes who watched me from behind the legs of adults who watched me from behind walls of suspicion and silence. The Gretchen ignored them. It walked through the settlement as if it were empty, heading for a storage area on the far side. The humans watched it pass with the familiar wariness of people who have learned the boundaries of a predator's attention. They knew the Gretchen would not bother them. They knew the rules. I stopped. I stared. A woman approached me. She was thin but not emaciated, with the kind of wiry toughness that comes from years of hard living. Her skin was pale, the pallor of someone who has never seen natural light. Her hair was cut short and practical. She looked at me, looked at my uniform, or what remained of it, looked at the scars and the missing fingers and the grime of WAAAGH's workshop, and she said something that I did not understand. It was not Orc language, and it was not Gothic. It was something else. A pigeon. A hybrid. When I did not respond, she tried again, and this time I caught fragments of what might have been Low Gothic, buried under layers of drift and distortion. Her name was Halvine. She was born here. Her mother was born here. Her grandmother was captured 60 years ago during a previous campaign, back when the warband was under a different war boss, before Kragmau Gut Basha killed his way to the top. They were not slaves in the way I was a slave. They were not assigned to workshops or labor details. They were something else, something I did not have a word for. They lived in the interstices of the Orc warband, in the gaps between Orc society, surviving on what fell through the cracks, tolerated as long as they stayed out of the way and occasionally useful when the Orcs needed hands that were smaller and more dexterous than their own. Halvine showed me the settlement while the Gretchen rummaged through the storage area, looking for WAAAGH's singing coil. She showed me the fungus gardens, where they grew their own varieties of the ubiquitous Orc fungus, cultivated over generations to be less toxic and more nutritious than the wild strains. She showed me the workshop, a small area where her people made their tools and repaired their shelters and occasionally manufactured items that they traded with the Gretchen for necessities. She showed me the infirmary, which was a corner of the hold with a thin mattress and a collection of crude medical instruments, and a woman named Olek, who served as their healer, using knowledge passed down from grandmother to daughter, like an oral tradition of survival. She did not show me everything. I could tell. There were areas she steered me away from, curtained sections at the back of the hold that she did not acknowledge. I did not push. Pushing would have ended the conversation. I found the singing coil. I brought it back to WAAAGH's workshop. I did not speak about what I had seen, not to Brannick, not to Kalam, not to Torben. During this period, I returned to the settlement in the hold twice more. Halvine became something like a contact, though she never fully trusted me and I never fully trusted her. She answered my questions about her people with the guarded precision of someone who has learned that information is currency and should not be given away cheaply. I learned that the hold dwellers, as I came to think of them, had their own rituals around the WAAAGH field. They gathered in groups and chanted, not Orc chants, human chants in their pigeon tongue, rhythmic and repetitive and designed, Halvine said, to align their thinking with the field. When enough of them chanted together, things happened. Small things. A broken pipe sealing itself, a flickering light steadying, a piece of equipment that had refused to work suddenly humming to life. The effects were minor compared to what the Orcs could achieve, but they were real. I witnessed one, a water reclamation unit that Olek, the healer, had been trying to repair for weeks. It was hopelessly broken, missing critical components, patched with materials that should not have been compatible. Halvine gathered a group of about 30 of the hold dwellers around it. They chanted. The rhythm was hypnotic, building in layers, each voice adding a new frequency to the sound, until it was not so much a chant as a vibration that you felt in the floor and the walls and the air. After about 10 minutes, the machine coughed, sputtered, and began working. Not well, not efficiently, but working. Water dripped from its output valve, brownish and tasting of metal but potable. The machine had been dead, and belief brought it back. I felt it happen. I was standing close enough to the group that I was inside the radius of whatever they generated, and I felt the moment the field engaged. It was like a current of warm water passing through me. My skin tingled. My missing fingers ached, which should have been impossible. And for one brief, irrational moment, I believed the machine would work. Not thought, not hoped. Believed with a certainty that came from somewhere outside my own mind, as if the conviction had been injected into me through the air itself. That moment frightened me more than anything else that had happened to me since my capture, because it meant the field was not limited to orcs. It could affect humans. It could use humans. And if it could use me, then I was not just a prisoner in WAAAGH's workshop. I was a component, a piece of the machine. My fear, my attention, my inadvertent moments of wonder when I watched the Mekboy create something impossible, all of it was feeding the field. All of it was making WAAAGH's weapons work better. I was part of the WAAAGH. That realization sat in my gut like swallowed metal. I carried it back to the workshop and said nothing, but I could not stop doing what I always did. I started measuring it. I started watching for correlations. When the workshop was full of excited orcs, did WAAAGH's weapons test better? When the humans were afraid, was the field stronger or weaker? When I was close to the weapon during testing, did the shots hit harder than when I stood far away? I cataloged everything. I kept a mental ledger the way I had kept counts of ammunition for the heavy weapons platoon. And the more I tracked, the more I saw patterns. Human fear amplified the field. Human awe amplified it more. But human analysis, the cold act of measuring and cataloging and comparing, did something else entirely. It dampened the field, not much, a fraction. But consistently, repeatably, measurably. My attention to the mechanism was corrosive to the mechanism. The more I understood, the less the field worked around me. I tried to stop. I told myself to stop counting, stop measuring, stop trying to understand how a psychic field operated by quantifying its effects. But telling a counter to stop counting is like telling a heart to stop beating. The habit was lodged too deep. Every time I watched WAAAGH fire the weapon, I was unconsciously calculating impact radius, recovery time, energy yield. Every calculation was a grain of doubt, and grains accumulate. I looked at the other human slaves differently now, at Brannick, who had stopped humming his hymn fragment and started humming something that sounded almost orc. At Kellum, whose precise, careful work had taken on a quality that I can only describe as devoted, as if she was no longer merely assembling components but performing a sacrament. At Torben, who spoke orc better than most Gretchen now and who sometimes, in unguarded moments, gestured and postured in ways that were unmistakably greenskin. They were being absorbed. I was doing something different. I was being absorbed and resisting the absorption simultaneously, and the friction between those two processes was generating something that did not belong in the way field. Skepticism. The quiet, corrosive human conviction that everything has a mechanism, and mechanisms can be understood, and understanding strips the magic away. It was on the third visit that Halvine finally showed me what she had been hiding. Maybe she had decided I could be trusted. Maybe she had decided it did not matter. She pulled aside the curtain at the back of the hold and led me into a small space, maybe 2 meters by 2 meters, lit by a single dim light. On the wall, someone had painted a mural. Not well. The artistic skill was crude, the proportions wrong, the colors limited to whatever pigments could be mixed from available materials. But the image was unmistakable. 2 faces, one above the other. One grinning with savage delight, the other grinning with cunning satisfaction. 2 orc faces, rendered by human hands, staring out from the wall with eyes that seemed to follow you. Gork and Mork. The orc gods. Cunning brutality and brutal cunning. The twin deities of the wall. Halvine saw my expression. She did not explain. She did not need to. The shrine, the paintings, the small offerings of food and scrap metal and teeth laid at the base of the wall, they explained themselves. These people, these human beings born in captivity, raised in the belly of an orc warship, had adapted. They had done what humans always do. They had survived. And the tool they had used to survive was belief. Not belief in the God Emperor, who had never come for them. Not belief in the Imperium, which did not know they existed. Belief in the only power that had any relevance in their world. The WAAAGH, the same force that powered Mugzog's weapons and Crag Mao's fists, and the unstoppable green tide that swept across the galaxy. I stood in front of that shrine, and I felt something move inside me. Not horror, though horror was part of it. Not pity, though pity was there too. Something deeper and more unsettling. Recognition. These people had not become orcs. They were still human. They still loved their children and cared for their sick and told stories and made art. But they had plugged themselves into the orc ecosystem like a vine wrapping around a tree. They drew sustenance from the WAAAGH field, and in return they fed it. Their belief, their awe, their fear, their worship of Gork and Mork, all of it flowed into the same psychic current that powered the orc warband. They were not parasites, they were not collaborators, they were symbiotes, part of the machine. And the most terrifying thing was not that they had done this. The most terrifying thing was that it worked. These people were healthy, their children were growing, their community had survived for 3 generations in conditions that should have killed them within months. And they had done it by believing in the same force that their captors believed in. The WAAAGH field did not discriminate. It did not care if the belief came from a green-skinned skull or a pale, thin human woman kneeling before a crude painting on a metal wall. Belief was belief, and it worked. Halvine watched me process this. Then she said something that Torben would later help me fully translate, though I understood the gist of it at the time. She said roughly, "The green gods protect those who protect themselves. That is the first truth. The second truth is that the green gods do not know who is green and who is not. They only know who believes." I left the hold and went back to Mugzog's workshop. I did not speak about what I had seen. I kept it inside, the way you keep a shard of glass inside a wound, because pulling it out would cause more damage than leaving it in. But the knowledge was there. It changed the way I looked at everything. It changed the way I looked at Mugzog's weapons, at the WAAAGH field, at my own survival, at the terrible weapon that sat on its carriage in the workshop, waiting to be used. Because if belief was all it took, then belief was also all that could be taken away. The WAAAGH moved on. That is what WAAAGHs do. They consume and they move, like a fire that is also a migration. Kragmal Gutbasha had set his sights on a system called the Varanthor Reach, 3 inhabited worlds and a handful of mining stations strung across a modest cluster on the edge of Segmentum Obscurus. The orcs cared nothing for strategic value. Kragmal wanted to fight, and the Varanthor Reach had people to fight, so the Varanthor Reach was the target. The logic was that simple and that absolute. During the transit, Mugzog refined Da Fink Blaster. He adjusted the lattice of wires around the chamber, tightening some connections, loosening others, adding new elements that he seemed to select on instinct rather than any technical principle I could identify. He repainted the weapon 3 times, each time in a different shade of red, because the orcs believe that red makes things more powerful, and Mugzog wanted this weapon to be as powerful as possible. The 3rd coat of red was so dark it was almost black, and it gleamed under the workshop lights like a wound. He added spikes, naturally. No orc weapon is complete without spikes. He added a chain of teeth around the barrel, taken from a dozen different species. Human teeth mixed with orc teeth mixed with things I did not recognize. He added a small effigy of Gork, or possibly Mork, bolted to the rear of the carriage, facing backward, which Torben suggested might be either a religious blessing or a rude gesture, depending on which god it actually represented. He also painted a grinning face on the barrel shroud. When I made the mistake of looking at it too closely, WAAAGH bellowed, "That's not for you, that's for WH40K," meaning the face was decorative from the target's perspective, not the shooter's. Orc aesthetic logic is its own field of study, and it is a field that drives you insane if you study it too long. Through all of this, I was there, handing tools, holding components, counting bolts and wire lengths and paint quantities, and watching, always watching. I had developed a habit over the months of observing WAAAGH's hands as he worked. Not his human skin hand, which was massive and green and blunt-fingered, and capable of surprising gentleness when handling delicate components. The claw, the hydraulic arm. Because the claw did things that hands should not be able to do. It would reach for a part, and the part would be there, even when I knew it had not been there a moment before. It would weld a seam, and the seam would hold, even when the metals being joined were incompatible. It would tighten a bolt, and the bolt would bite, even when the thread was stripped. The claw did not obey physics. It obeyed WAAAGH, and WAAAGH obeyed something deeper than thought. The first world of the Varanthor Reach fell quickly. Varanthor Primaris was a mining world with a garrison of approximately 20,000 PDF troops and no significant orbital defenses. The orcs dropped on them like a green avalanche, landing craft and rocks and teleporting boys directly into the defensive lines. I watched the invasion from the workshop, through a viewport that WAAAGH had installed so he could observe the performance of his weapons in real combat conditions. The fighting lasted 3 days. I did not count the dead because there were too many to count, but the sound of it came through the hull in waves, vibrations that shook the workshop and made the hanging chains sway like metal vines in a wind. WAAAGH did not deploy Dafink Blaster for Varanthor Primaris. The weapon was not ready, he said. Ready was not a technical judgment. Structurally, the weapon had been complete for weeks. Ready was a spiritual judgment. WAAAGH was waiting for something, though he could not articulate what, and I suspect he would have killed anyone who asked him to articulate it. He spent the battle in the workshop, working on the weapon, adjusting things that did not need adjusting, polishing surfaces that served no functional purpose, talking to the weapon in low, rumbling orc speak that Torben could not fully translate because the words WAAAGH used were not standard orc vocabulary. They were private words, workshop words, the language of a maker speaking to his creation in a register too intimate for outsiders. The second world, Varanthor Secundus, was an agri world, a real one, not one of the idyllic fields of golden grain agri worlds that exist in propaganda materials. A grimdark industrial hell of rad-scored soil and chem-stunted crops, and a population of 60,000 laborers who lived in prefab barracks and ate the worst of what they grew while the best was shipped off-world to feed hive cities they would never see. The garrison was minimal. The PDF was a militia, barely armed, barely trained. It should have been another easy conquest. It was not. Varanthor Secundus had an Astra Militarum presence that the Orc Scouts had either missed or failed to report. A full regiment, the Stelvani 44th Rifles, stationed there as part of a sector-wide redeployment following a Chaos incursion 2 subsectors away. They were not elite troops, but they were professional, experienced, and well-equipped, and they had had time to prepare defensive positions when the Orc fleet was detected in system. Kragmal Gut Basha did not care. He ordered the assault anyway because Kragmal's strategic philosophy could be summarized as hit it, and if it hits back, hit it harder. The Orcs landed in force, and the battle that followed was the first real fight the warband had faced since before my capture. The Stelvane rifles fought well. They held their lines. They counterattacked. They used armor, artillery, air support. They killed Orcs in significant numbers, which is hard to do because Orcs are extremely difficult to kill and even harder to keep killed. But they held. For 5 days they held, and the warband's advance stalled. It was on the 6th day that Mugzog decided Da Fink Blaster was ready. I do not know what changed in his mind, what internal threshold was crossed, what spiritual criterion was finally met. He simply stood up from his workbench, looked at the weapon, and said a single word that Torben later translated as now. Not a command, not a decision, a statement of fact. The weapon was ready now. Not yesterday, not tomorrow. Now. As if the weapon itself had told him. The deployment was elaborate by Orc standards, which means it was complete chaos with a thin veneer of intentionality. Da Fink Blaster was loaded onto a battle wagon, a massive armored vehicle that looked like someone had welded 3 trucks together and covered the result in guns. The driver was an Orc named Boslit, who had lost both his original eyes in previous crashes and replaced them with headlamps wired directly into his skull, which meant he could only see when they were switched on and tended to drive blind when the power flickered. Torben told me later that Boslit considered this an improvement over biological eyes because, and I am quoting the translation here, the old ones couldn't do high beams. I was ordered onto the battle wagon as well, because Mugzog wanted his inventory nearby in case the weapon needed field adjustments. Brannick came too, because someone needed to haul ammunition, even though Da Fink Blaster's ammunition was just those metal spheres that could not possibly be projectiles. Torben came because someone needed to translate. Kellum stayed behind to mind the workshop. I envied her. The battle wagon rumbled out of the landing zone and into the war zone, and the scale of the battle hit me with a physical force. I had been insulated from combat inside the ship, seeing it through viewports and hearing it through hull plating. Being in it was different. The noise was a solid thing, a wall of sound that pressed against your chest and made breathing difficult. Explosions bloomed across the landscape like flowers opening in fast forward. The ground shook constantly, a low rumble punctuated by sharper impacts that threw dirt and debris into the air. Lines of tracer fire arced across the sky in lurid green and angry red. And everywhere, Orcs. Boys in their thousands, charging, screaming, shooting, dying, killing. An avalanche of green flesh and crude iron that swept across the muddy fields of Varanthor Secundus like a tide of violence. The Imperial lines were visible ahead, a network of trenches and bunkers and gun emplacements that flashed with latfire and autocannon bursts. The Stelvane rifles were giving everything they had. Leman Russ battle tanks anchored their flanks, their turrets traversing in steady arcs, each shot punching through the Orc ranks and leaving smoking gaps that filled again almost immediately. Heavy bolters chattered from fortified positions. A basilisk battery somewhere behind the lines sent shells arcing overhead, each impact erupting in a geyser of earth and green body parts. They were holding, barely, desperately, but holding. Mugzog positioned the battle wagon on a low rise about 300 meters from the Imperial lines. He had the Gretchen crew unlock Da Fink Blaster's travel clamps and rotate the weapon to face the enemy. I loaded the chamber with one of the metal spheres, my hands working automatically, the familiar rhythm of ammunition handling overriding the terror that was trying to lock my muscles. Mugzog checked the weapon, adjusted a wire, tightened a bolt that did not need tightening. Then he gripped the handles, planted his feet on the battle wagon's deck, and aimed at the center of the Imperial line, where the heaviest concentration of defensive fire was coming from. I stood behind him. Brannick stood beside me. Torben crouched near the front of the vehicle, translating battlefield commands that were being screamed from orc to orc across the advance. We were close enough to Mugzog that I could see the muscles in his shoulders bunch under his skin, close enough to hear the lenses in his mechanical eye clicking into alignment, close enough to feel something that I can only describe as a gathering, a pulling inward. As if the air around Mugzog was being drawn toward him, toward the weapon, toward some focal point that existed in a dimension I could not see but could absolutely, unmistakably feel. He believed. In that moment, Mugzog believed in Dafink Blaster with every fiber of his massive, engineered-for-war body. He believed it would fire. He believed it would destroy. He believed it would prove everything he had ever thought about the nature of the WAAAGH and the relationship between conviction and reality. And his belief was not abstract. It was not philosophical. It was as concrete and physical as his claw, as his tusks, as his scarred green hide. He believed the way an orc believes, with total, unreflective, magnificent certainty. He pulled the trigger. The bolt that came out of Dafink Blaster was not like the test shots on the ship. Those had been impressive. This was something else entirely. The barrel erupted in a column of green-white light that was so bright it left afterimages burned into my vision for hours afterward. The bolt crossed 300 meters of battlefield in a fraction of a second and struck the Imperial line dead center. The explosion, if you can call it that, was not an explosion. It was an erasure. A section of the defensive line, roughly 50 meters wide, simply stopped existing. Trenches, bunkers, soldiers, weapons, sandbags, earth, all of it was gone, replaced by a crater that smoked and glowed with a light that was not heat and was not radiation, and was something I have never been able to name. The shockwave knocked me off my feet, knocked Brannick flat, sent Torben tumbling against the battle wagon's hull. Even Mugzog swayed, though he kept his grip on the weapon. The orcs around us went berserk. The WAAAGH energy spiked so hard that I felt my teeth crack, actually crack, the enamel splitting along stress lines that I would feel with my tongue for weeks afterward. The greenskins poured through the gap in the Imperial line like water through a broken dam. The battle was not over, but the outcome was decided in that single shot. The Stelvane rifles' defense had been built on the integrity of their line, and that integrity was gone, replaced by a smoking crater and 50 meters of nothing where hundreds of soldiers had been standing seconds before. Mugzog fired 3 more times that day. Each shot was devastating. Each shot annihilated a section of the Imperial defense. By the end of the day, the Stelvane 44th Rifles had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Pockets of resistance held out for another 2 days, but the outcome was decided. Varanthor Secundus fell, and Dafink Blaster was the reason. In the aftermath, Mugzog became something new within the warband's hierarchy. He had always been respected as a Mekboy. Now he was feared as a weapon maker. Kragmau Gutbasha himself came to the workshop, which was unprecedented. The war boss had to duck to fit through the doorway and still cracked a ceiling pipe with his head, which he headbutted again on principle because nothing hits a war boss without getting hit back. He stood in the middle of WAAAGH's domain, surrounded by scrap and oil and the nervous stares of human slaves, and he looked at WH40K blaster. He walked around it. He sniffed it, which is an orc evaluation method I had observed before but never understood. Then he pointed at it and said something that Torben translated as, "WH40K, it's proper orky. Build me another one." WAAAGH's lenses aligned, all of them settling into the same measured focus he used when examining something he had just built. He did not build another one. He told the war boss that there could only be one, that the weapon was unique, that building another would dilute the first, weaken it, split its power. I do not know if this was true or if WAAAGH simply did not want to share. With orcs, possessiveness and spiritual conviction are often indistinguishable. Kragmaw grunted. He did not argue, which surprised me. War bosses argue with everything. But Kragmaw looked at WH40K blaster, and something in the way he looked at it suggested that he felt it too. The gathering, the pull, the sense of concentrated belief that hung around the weapon like an invisible fog. He respected it. Or feared it. With orcs, those are also often indistinguishable. The WAAAGH moved on toward the third world, Veranthor Tertius, and it was there on that world that everything fell apart. Veranthor Tertius was a hive world, not a large one, not a Necromunda or an Armageddon, but a world with 3 hive cities and a combined population of several hundred million. It had proper defenses, orbital gun platforms, void shields, a planetary defense force that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and as the orc fleet approached and the augur readings became clearer, something else, something that made the orc knobs grin with anticipation and the human slaves exchange looks of queasy dread. There were ships in orbit that were not PDF ships, warships, Imperial Navy, and among them one vessel whose silhouette even I could recognize from basic guard training, a strike cruiser, Astartes. I did not know which chapter. The briefings we received as guard troopers on WH40K Tertius were rudimentary at best, and identifying Space Marine vessels by hull configuration alone was well above my training level. But the ship was there, and its presence changed the equation entirely. This was not going to be another Veranthor Primaris walkover, or a Veranthor Secundus slugfest. This was going to be a real war, against real defenders, with the Emperor's own angels of death among them. Kragmaw Gut Basha was delighted. Torben heard him bellowing at his knobs through 3 decks of hull plating. "The metal humies is here. The proper odd ones. Finally a good scrap." He wanted a proper fight. The war had been building momentum, growing with each conquest, and the greenskins were at a fever pitch of bloodlust and energy. The Gestalt field was stronger than I had ever felt it. Just walking through the corridors of the fleet, you could feel it, a constant pressure behind your eyes, a buzzing in your bones, a sense that the air itself was charged with violent potential. My missing fingers ached constantly. My teeth, already cracked from the first firing of WH40K blaster, throbbed in their sockets. The other human slaves were affected too. Brannick had stopped humming entirely and had started muttering in what I realized was orc battle cant, fragments of war chants that he had absorbed without noticing. Kellum worked with a feverish intensity that went beyond dedication into something like religious ecstasy. Torben had begun calling me by an orc nickname that roughly translated to Count Git, and he seemed to have forgotten that he had a human name at all. We were losing ourselves, all of us. The WAAAGH field was so strong that it was overriding our human identities, filling the spaces in our minds the way water fills a sponge. And the worst part was that it felt good. The field carried with it a sense of purpose, of belonging, of certainty that no human institution had ever given me. As a guard loader, I had been a number. Serial number 4411-Gelvis-77, Weapon Station 3, replacement available. In the WAAAGH field, I was part of something alive and vast and furiously certain of itself. I knew, with the part of my brain that was still human, that this intoxication was the first step to losing everything that made me who I was. But you cannot stop a current by standing in it. It was during this transit to Varanthor Tertius that my relationship with WAAAGH changed in a way that I still do not fully understand. I had always been his slave, his inventory, his count git. But as Darfink Blaster proved itself and WAAAGH's status rose within the warband, something shifted. He began talking near me, not to me. Orcs do not talk to humans the way humans talk to each other, but near me in my presence, in a way that suggested he was using me as a sounding board, the way you might talk to a work animal or a favorite tool. He would sit at his bench working on the weapon, adjusting the lattice, polishing the barrel, and he would talk. About the weapon, about belief, about the nature of the WAAAGH, about what he thought he had discovered. Torben translated, though the concepts were difficult and some of the words had no human equivalent. The gist was this. WAAAGH believed that field was not a side effect of orc psychology. He believed it was the other way around, that the field was the primary thing, the fundamental force, and that orc psychology was shaped around it, the way a river shapes its banks. The orcs did not create the field through belief. The field created belief through the orcs. They were channels, conduits, tools of a force that was older and larger and more powerful than any single orc or any single WAAAGH could comprehend. And Darfink Blaster was not just a weapon, it was a proof that the field could be isolated, channeled, focused, turned into something specific and measurable and repeatable. A proof that belief was not just a feeling, it was a force, the most powerful force in the universe. I listened to this, and one night, while WAAAGH was adjusting the lattice and muttering about the field's flow, I made a mistake. I was not trying to sabotage anything. I was being what I had always been, a counter. WAAAGH was describing how the weapon fed on conviction, how the bolt's strength scaled with the purity of the user's belief, and I was running the numbers in my head the way I always did. And without thinking, I held up a data board where I had been tracking ammunition stocks, and I showed him a column of figures. The discharge intensity readings from every test firing, listed in sequence. I had measured them by the size of the impact crater, by the depth of the penetration, by the recovery time between shots. I had done this because measuring things was what I did. It was compulsive, automatic. WAAAGH looked at the figures. His lenses clicked, and for the first time I saw something change in his posture. Because the figures showed something I had not intended to show him. The weapon's output was inconsistent, not random but variable, correlating to factors that I had not been able to isolate, but which were clearly there in the data. Some shots were 20% weaker than others, fired by the same orc, under apparently identical conditions. The weapon's performance was not a clean line. It was a scatter pattern, and scatter patterns imply variables. Variables imply mechanisms. Mechanisms imply something that can be measured, analyzed, understood. And the moment you can understand something, you are no longer purely believing in it. You are studying it. WAAAGH stared at those numbers for a long time. Then he said something that Torben could not fully translate, though the closest approximation was "Numbers is for grots." Then he hit the data board out of my hands and went back to work. He did not speak near me for 3 days afterward, but the damage was done. I had shown him data, and data is the enemy of faith. Over the following days, as the fleet closed on Varanthor Tertius and the preparations for the assault intensified, WAAAGH tested Da Fink Blaster repeatedly, firing at debris targets in the void. Each test was successful, but now WAAAGH was watching the results differently. Before, he had fired and accepted. Now he was firing and measuring, comparing, evaluating. I could see it in the way his lenses tracked the impact points, in the way he paused after each shot, in the slight frown that creased his massive brow. He was thinking about the weapon, analyzing it, treating it like a mechanism instead of a miracle. And the shots were getting weaker. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I noticed. The bolts that Da Fink Blaster produced during these tests were perhaps 10% less intense than the bolts it had produced on Varanthor Secundus. Then 15%. Then 20%. I had infected him. Not with a disease, with a habit. The habit of counting. The habit of measuring. The habit of asking how, instead of simply accepting that. My habit. The one thing that made me useful, and the one thing that was now slowly, steadily killing the most powerful weapon in the warband. Was I doing it on purpose? I do not know. My survival depended on the warband. My humanity depended on its failure. Both things were true at the same time, and neither one won. The assault on Varanthor Tertius began on what the orcs called Crumpin Day, which was any day they fought, which was most days, so the designation was not particularly useful. Kragmalgut Basha led the first wave personally, dropping in a massive rock that punched through the orbital defenses and hit the outskirts of Hive Primus like a meteorite with passengers. The initial landings were contested fiercely. The Imperial Navy engaged the Orc fleet in orbit, and the sky above the Hive world was a light show of lance beams and plasma fire, and the bright, brief flashes of exploding ships. On the ground, the PDF and the Space Marines met the Orc advance with a level of resistance that the warband had not yet encountered. The Space Marines were from a chapter one later learned was called the Blades Penitent. I have no idea if that name means anything to anyone hearing this. They were not a famous chapter. They did not have a legendary Primarch or 10,000 years of glorious history. They were a successor chapter, founded in the recent millennia, stationed in the sector to deal with exactly this kind of threat. There were perhaps 60 of them on Varanthor Tertius, which sounds like a small number until you watch 60 Space Marines engage several thousand orcs and hold them to a standstill. They were deployed around Hive Primus in tactical squads, each squad anchoring a section of the defense line, and where they stood, the orcs could not advance. I watched this from the battle wagon. WAAAGH had deployed again, positioning Da Fink Blaster on a ridge overlooking the eastern approach to the Hive. The weapon was loaded. WAAAGH stood behind it, his claw gripping the handles, his lenses aligned on the distant Imperial lines. And for the first time since I had known him, he hesitated. It was not obvious hesitation. An orc who hesitated obviously would be challenged and probably killed. It was subtle. A fractional pause, a slight adjustment of his grip that was not mechanical adjustment, but nervous readjustment. The kind of tell that only someone who had spent months observing every micro-movement of this specific orc would notice. And I noticed, because I was the counter, the observer, the one who measured things. WAAAGH was afraid. Not afraid of the Space Marines, not afraid of the battle. He was afraid that Da Fink Blaster would not work. The doubt had gotten inside him. I could see it in the fractional tremor of his claw, in the way his lenses kept cycling without settling. Once doubt gets inside an orc, it feeds on itself because an orc has no framework for processing it, no experience, no coping mechanism, just a growing, unfamiliar cold in a place where there had only ever been fire. He pulled the trigger anyway. The bolt was powerful. It crossed the battlefield and struck a section of the defensive line, destroying a gun emplacement and killing dozens of PDF soldiers. But it was not the world-ending annihilation that he had produced on Varanthor Secundus. It was a conventional devastation, spectacular but not impossible. The kind of damage a basilisk battery might inflict. The kind of damage that could be explained by conventional physics. Mugzog knew it. His lenses clicked rapidly. He slammed his fist against the weapon's housing and screamed at it, "Work, Yazogin!" "Thing work!" A raw orc bellow that was half command and half plea. He adjusted the lattice with his claw, tightened something, loosened something else. His hands were shaking. I had never seen an orc's hands shake before. He fired again. The second shot was weaker still. It hit the Imperial lines but did not penetrate the heavy fortifications. Debris flew, bodies were thrown. But the line held. The defenses remained intact. And that is when I said it. Not deliberately. The question came out of my mouth the way my hands cleared jams, automatically. Because I was a counter, and counters need to know how things work. Mugzog was staring at the weapon, his lenses spinning, trying to understand why it was failing. And I asked, clumsy orc speak, barely audible over the battle's roar. "What makes da thing work?" 5 words. That was all it took. Mugzog heard me. Every lens in his mechanical eye locked at once, frozen in perfect alignment, focused not on the weapon but on me. And I saw him try to answer. I saw a Mekboy, for the first time in his life, reach into his own mind for the mechanism behind his creation, the explanation, the chain of cause and effect. And there was nothing there. There had never been anything there. He was looking for the how, and the looking was the poison, and it was already in his blood. I felt the WAAAGH field around us collapse, not stutter. Collapse. The orcs in the vicinity staggered. The charge they were building toward faltered. The wave that should have crashed over the Imperial defenses broke apart like something solid hitting a wall. Mugzog fired a third time. The bolt barely crossed 100 meters before fizzling into nothing. A spark, a cough of light, and then silence. The weapon was dead in his hands. He screamed. Not a war cry, not a challenge, a sound of pure frustration and rage, and something that, in a human, I would have called anguish. He hit the weapon with his claw. He hit it again. The lenses in his eye were spinning wildly, unfocused, flicking between ranges like a man trying to find something solid to focus on in a room full of smoke. He was trying to go back, trying to stop thinking, trying to unknow the question I had planted in his head. But you cannot unask a question. You cannot unfind the absence of an answer. He turned and looked at me, his lenses locked, all of them, focused on me with an intensity that I will carry in my memory until I die. He said one word. Torben, cowering behind a supply crate, did not translate it then. Days later, he told me the word was closest in meaning to counter, not unbeliever. Counter, the one who counts, the one who measures, the one who asks how. And then the Space Marines counterattacked. It happened fast, faster than I could process. One moment, Mugzog was staring at me, his claw raised, his lenses locked, on the verge of killing me or demanding an explanation or both. The next moment, the eastern flank of the Orc advance collapsed under a concentrated assault by 3 squads of the Blade's Penitent, supported by PDF armor and a Valkyrie gunship that screamed overhead and raked the Orc positions with heavy bolter fire. The battle wagon took a direct hit from a Lascanen. The vehicle's side armor, which was thick but crudely welded, blew inward in a shower of molten metal. Brannick was hit by a piece of shrapnel that took off the top of his head. He was dead before his body hit the deck, his enormous hands still clenching and unclenching in reflex. I was thrown across the interior of the battle wagon by the blast. I hit the far wall and felt ribs crack. The world went white, then red, then very, very loud. The battle wagon was on fire. Orcs were screaming. The Gretchen crew were either dead or fleeing. Through the smoke and the flame, I could see Mugzog, still standing, still gripping the weapon, still alive. Because orcs are built to survive things that would reduce a human to components. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds. His hydraulic claw was damaged, leaking dark fluid. But he was standing. He looked at Da Fink Blaster. He looked at the approaching Space Marines, their blue-gray armor visible through the smoke, like ghosts materializing from a nightmare. He looked at the weapon again, and I saw the moment he decided. He let go of the handles, stepped back, looked at the weapon one final time, and all his lenses went still, the way they did when he had finished thinking and made up his mind. Then he picked up a chopper, a crude axe that had been stowed under the driver's seat, and he walked toward the Space Marines. Without the weapon, without belief, with nothing but the oldest orc certainty there is, that a good fight is its own reward. I heard the combat, metal on ceramite, the wet heavy sounds of orc muscle meeting engineered superhuman bone. A chainsword's howl, the crunch of the hydraulic claw closing on something hard, then a single shot, sharp and final, a bolt pistol, then silence. Mugzor Rivetgob died 23 meters from the burning battle wagon, face down in the mud of Varanthor Tertius, killed by a weapon that worked the old-fashioned way. Powder, propellant, physics, no belief required. I pulled myself out of the battle wagon through a hole in the floor. The battle was still raging, but the eastern flank was collapsing. Orcs were streaming back from the Imperial counterattack, not routed but withdrawing, reorganizing, looking for softer targets. The Space Marines did not pursue. They held their ground, consolidated, and let the orcs come to them again. They would be there when the next wave arrived. They would hold until the ammunition ran out, or the walls fell, or every last one of them was dead. That is what Space Marines do. I crawled. I found Torben, alive but injured, his left arm broken and his face covered in blood from a scalp wound. Together we moved away from the wreckage, away from the front line, away from the immediate killing zone, and into a crater that provided minimal cover but at least blocked the line of sight from any trigger-happy orc who might mistake us for enemies. We lay there for hours, listening to the battle rage above us, listening to the war, field surge and ebb and surge again, as the orcs threw themselves at the Imperial defenses in wave after wave of green fury. Da Fink Blaster was sitting in the burning battle wagon, abandoned, uncrewed. The weapon that only fired if you believed it would, silent and cold and dead. I should have left it there. Any sane human would have left it there. I should have used the chaos of the battle to disappear, to find the hold dwellers in whatever ship still held them, to hide until the fighting was over and then try to find a way out. I should have done a lot of things. Instead, I went back. The battle wagon was burning, but orc vehicles burn slowly. They are built from materials that resist combustion, not through engineering but through stubbornness. The fire was eating through the vehicle from the front, where the Lascanen had struck, working its way backward through the driver's compartment and the crew section. The rear, where Da Fink Blaster was mounted, was hot and filling with smoke, but not yet in flames. I reached the weapon. It was intact. The lattice was undamaged, the barrel was scorched, but whole. The trigger, that useless decorative piece of curved metal connected to nothing, was exactly where it had always been. The carriage was warped from the heat, but the wheels still turned. I unbolted the travel clamps, which took longer than it should have because my hands were slippery with blood that I later realized was not mine, and I dragged the weapon off the battle wagon's rear ramp and onto the churned ground of the battlefield. It weighed approximately 300 kilograms. I know this because I had cataloged its components during construction, and I can add, 300 kilograms is too much for one person to move, especially one person with cracked ribs and 8 fingers, and the physical conditioning of a prisoner who had been eating fungus for the better part of a year. But Torben saw me struggling with it before I reached the crater. He came out, broken arm and all, grabbed one of the carriage rails with his good hand, and pulled alongside me. We did not speak. We just hauled. Together, one agonizing meter at a time, we dragged it to the crater's lip. Torben did not ask why I had gone back for the weapon. He did not ask what I intended to do with it. He just helped me move it, and then sat back down in the mud, cradling his broken arm, watching me with an expression I could not read. I positioned a Fink Blaster on the lip of the crater. The weapon was designed to be crewed by an orc, so the handles were too large for my hands, and the sightline was set for someone a meter taller than me. I had to stand on a piece of debris to reach the grips, which put me above the rim of the crater and exposed me to any stray fire that happened to pass through my section of the battlefield. The Imperial lines were 200 meters ahead. The Orc advance was reforming to the west, a new wave gathering for another push. Between the two armies, the ground was churned earth and broken bodies and the smoking wreckage of vehicles from both sides. I loaded a sphere into the chamber, one of 4 remaining. And then I stood there with my human hands on the 2 large handles of an orc weapon that ran on belief. Part of me wanted to aim at the Imperial positions because the WAAAGH was screaming in my blood for destruction. Part of me wanted to turn the weapon around and fire into the green tide. Both impulses were real. Both pulled at me for about 3 seconds, which felt like an hour. I aimed at neither. I aimed at a wrecked Lehman Russ battle tank about 150 meters away, abandoned and burning, its turret blown off, already dead, already destroyed, but big and solid and there. I pulled the trigger. I believed, Throne of Terra, I believed, not as a test, not as curiosity. I believed with everything that months in the WAAAGH field had built inside me. I did not think. I did not count. I did not ask how. I just believed, the way Mugzog had believed before I ruined him. The weapon fired. The bolt was not green-white. It was green-gold. I do not know what that means. I do not know if the color correlated with the species of the wielder, or the quality of the belief, or some other variable that I had not catalogued, but it was beautiful, in the way that destruction is sometimes beautiful, and it crossed 150 meters of battlefield, and it hit the dead Lehman Russ, and the tank ceased to exist. Not exploded. Ceased. A crater remained, shallow and wide, with edges that glowed the same nameless light I had seen on Varanthor Secundus. Torben screamed, not in pain, in shock. He had seen what I had done. He had seen a human fire an orc weapon that should not have worked for a human. He had seen belief manifest as force from a species that was supposed to be incapable of contributing to the WAAAGH field. I stood there. The handles were hot under my palms. My missing fingers ached so badly that I could feel them, could feel the ghosts of them curling around the metal grip. For 1 second, maybe 2, I was not afraid, and I was not thinking, and I was not anything at all except certain, completely, blindingly certain, the way orcs are certain, the way humans are not supposed to be. Then the second passed, and I was Sullick Vorne again. The WAAAGH was still pulsing through me like a tide that would never fully recede. The ammunition box held 3 more spheres, 3 more shots, 3 more proofs. I did not fire them. The counter in me had one last thing to count: the cost. If I fired again, if I proved it again, the proving would become a habit, and habits become needs, and needs become chains. I had watched that process consume Mugzog from the inside. I was not going to let it consume me. I pulled the remaining spheres from the ammunition box and threw them into the burning wreckage of the battle wagon, where they would melt or detonate or simply cease to function. Then I put my shoulder against Da Fink Blaster's carriage and pushed. 300 kilograms of dead orc miracle rolled down the crater wall and into the mud at the bottom, where it sank 1/2 meter and settled at an angle. I kicked dirt over the lattice. I kicked more. I buried what I could. Not a proper burial. Enough to make it look like wreckage. Enough to make it invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for a weapon that ran on belief. Then I crawled back to Torben, and we lay in the crater, and we said nothing. The battle for Veranthor Tertius lasted another 3 weeks. The orcs lost. Not because Da Fink Blaster fell silent. Not because of the Space Marines or the PDF or the orbital defenses. The orcs lost because Kragmau Gut Basha was killed on the 14th day. We learned this during the Imperial debrief afterward, from tactical reports that the interrogators shared with us to cross-reference our own accounts. A power sword through the skull, delivered by a sergeant of the Blade's penitent, whose name I never learned. Without the war boss, the WAAAGH, fragmented. The warband split into competing factions, each led by a knob who wanted to be the new boss. They fought each other as much as they fought the Imperium. The cohesion collapsed. The field weakened. The green tide receded. I survived. Torben survived. Kellum did not. We found her body in the wreckage of the ship's workshop 3 days after the war boss fell, when the orc fleet began breaking apart in orbit, and pieces of it rained down on the battlefield like a second bombardment. She was at her workstation. Her hands were still arranged around a half-assembled trigger assembly, her fingers positioned with that precise, careful grip that had kept her alive for months. Something had hit the workshop, a stray shell or a chunk of falling debris, and she had died instantly, still working, still devoted to the task. I closed her eyes and took her toolkit because she would have wanted someone to use it, and because sentiment without utility is a luxury that prisoners cannot afford. We hid in the underbelly of a crashed orc transport for 8 days. The space was cramped and dark and stank of leaking fuel and the sweet rotting smell of dead Gretchen, who had been crushed in the crash. We ate emergency rations that Torben had stolen from a dead PDF trooper's kit, supplemented by mushrooms that Torben identified as safe to eat because he knew the orc species of edible fungus better than he knew the human varieties. We did not talk much. There was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. We listened to the battle fade above us, the sounds of warfare diminishing day by day as the orcs fragmented and the Imperium ground them down, and we waited for a silence that was safe rather than simply quiet. On the 7th night, lying in the dark with the stink of dead greenskins in my nostrils and the fading pulse of the WAAAGH field still buzzing in my bones, I thought about Halvine and the Hold Dwellers. I wondered if they had survived, if the ships they lived in had made it through the orbital battle or had been blown apart, scattering their settlement across the void. I wondered if their children, those pale, wide-eyed children born in the belly of an orc warship, had lived or died. And I wondered, with a cold clarity that I did not welcome, whether I should hope they had survived. Because if they had survived and the Imperium found them, what would the Imperium do with a community of humans who worshipped Gork and Mork and could channel, feel? The answer to that question kept me awake the entire night. When the fighting died down, we surrendered to an Imperial patrol. We were processed as recovered prisoners of war. We were questioned by the Commissariat, by the Ordo Xenos, by a Mechanicus Magos, who was interested in orc weapons technology. I told them some of what I had seen. I told them about the weapon's basic function. I told them about Moogzorg. I gave them technical details about orc construction methods that the Magos found valuable enough to classify. I did not tell them about the Hold Dwellers. A community of humans worshipping orc gods would not generate scholarly interest. It would generate kill orders. Whatever those people were, whatever they had become, they had children. I said nothing. I did not tell them that I fired the weapon. I did not tell them that it worked for me. I did not tell them about the golden green bolt, or the certainty, or the way my missing fingers still ache when the field is strong, which means they ache now, which means the field is always strong, which means I am still inside it even now, even here, even after the debrief and the quarantine and the reassignment and all the miles of distance between me and the buried wreckage on Varanthor Tertius. I did not tell them because I knew what would happen if I did. The Imperium does not tolerate contamination. A human who can channel the WAAAGH field is not a curiosity or a research subject. He is a heretic, an aberration, a threat to the species. And the thing that kept me alive through the screening was that there was nothing to find. Whatever the field had made of me, it left no mark a psyker could read, no warp signature an astropath would flag. It is not that kind of power. It does not announce itself. It just waits, quiet, in the spaces between certainty and doubt, until you pick up something broken and decide it will work. They would execute me if they knew, and they would be right to consider it. Because I am not what I was. I am not the loader who counted shells and carried ammunition and believed in nothing more exotic than the next meal and the next shift, and the weight of a Lascanon power cell in his hands. I am something else now. Something that was made in the workshop of a dead Mekboy on a burning battle wagon in a war that the orcs lost. Torben understood. He felt the same change in himself, the same residual hum, the same ache in places that should not ache. We never spoke about it. We do not need to. We carry it the way you carry a scar. Silently, permanently. They reassigned me to a logistics depot on a backwater world 3 subsectors from the Varanthor Reach. I count things. Munitions, rations, replacement parts. I am good at counting. I've always been good at counting. The work is quiet and repetitive, and exactly what a recovering prisoner of war should be doing, according to the Commissariat guidelines that govern such matters. Nobody looks at me twice. Nobody suspects anything. I am Loader Vorne, recovered POW, slightly damaged, mostly functional, assigned to Supply Depot Theta Varric, expected to serve out my remaining years in peaceful obscurity. But sometimes, late at night, when the depot is silent and the guards are dozing and the machines are humming their mindless mechanical hymns, I go to the back of the warehouse, to the corner where nobody looks, where the old equipment is stored, the broken stuff, the salvage that is waiting to be recycled or scrapped or forgotten, and I pick up a piece of machinery, something broken, Something dead. A Vox unit with a shattered crystal, a data slate with a cracked screen, a las gun with a burnt-out barrel. Things that do not work. Things that cannot work. Things that physics and engineering and the holy Omnisaya all agree are beyond repair. And I hold them. And I close my eyes. And I believe. And sometimes, more often than it should be, more often than any sane universe would permit, the dead thing in my hand stirs. The Vox crackles. The data slate flickers. The las gun hums, just for a moment, just a whisper of power through a barrel that should never carry power again. It lasts a second, maybe two, and then it dies, and I am standing in a dark warehouse holding a piece of junk, and I am Sullick Vorne, and I am alone, and I am human, mostly. The Mekboy built a gun that only fires if you believe it will. He stopped believing mid-battle, and it killed him. I asked him the question that killed his faith. And then I picked up his weapon, and I did not ask. And it fired. Emperor, forgive me. It fired.